Eu vou apresentar o professor Wido. It's nice having you here, Wido. Thank you very much. You accepted our invitation. It's always a good thing.
Nice to be here. Nice to be here, or there, or how you would say that online. But yeah.
Yeah, here and there. Wido Quist, professor doutor Wido Quist, é professor assistente em Patrimônio e Tecnologia e líder da seção Patrimônio e Arquitetura da Universidade Técnica de Delft, nos Países Baixos. Ele trabalha com transformação de cidades e edifícios, o que é também um dos temas principais da arquitetura hoje, também abordado pelo Heritage in Architecture. É Patrimônio e Arquitetura, né, a seção em que ele é líder. E tem foco em projetos baseados em patrimônio, incluindo preservação e renovação e reutilização adaptativa da arquitetura existente. A sua investigação e formação centra-se nos aspectos arquitetônicos e técnicos, envolvidos na crescente necessidade de conservação e transformação de edifícios e sítios, nomeadamente os de significado cultural. Wido Quist formou-se arquiteto e engenheiro na TU Delft. Seus interesses de pesquisa incluem, entre outros, história da conservação, teoria da preservação, materiais de construção do século XX, pedra natural e concreto pré-moldado. Ele pesquisa e orienta trabalhos em arquitetura com foco específico na intervenção de edifícios existentes, em geral na conservação, existência em geral e na conservação de edifícios em particular. Atualmente, o professor Wido Quist é presidente do Docomomo Holanda e é secretário-geral eleito do Docomomo Internacional, bem como membro do Comitê Científico da Conferência Internacional sobre História da Construção. Ele frequentemente atua como professor visitante, né, tem sido colaborador constante, né, o que agradecemos muito, como palestrante e também em atividades relacionadas à pesquisa e educação, né, incluindo conosco. Então, eu vou passar a palavra ao professor Wido.
Ceila, thank you for kindly introducing me, and thank you for inviting me to present on your wonderful event. I think the last year or the last 2 years, the most international presentations I did for Brazil. So thank you for inviting me every time, Ceila, and it's a pleasure to do so. Although last Monday, when I came back from my summer holidays, I was a bit worried what I had to do today, but it all figured out, and with the kind help of everybody, I prepared another presentation on a title we discussed, I mean Ceila and me discussed some time ago, Preservation Through Development, Dutch Approaches to Adaptive Reuse of Industrial Heritage. I will take you along some 70 slides, and let's see how it works out. If there is any problem whatsoever, if you can't understand me or something else, please let me know in words, because I do not see you waving now, because I'm looking at the screen where also my presentation is and where my notes are. I will take you along 70 slides. If it takes too long, just start yelling at me and I will speed up. Otherwise, I will try to finish in 45 or 50 minutes, as also introduced by Ceila. And then there is some time, I hope, for questions or discussion. So the aim of this presentation is actually to show you, on the other side of the world, some developments in adaptive reuse of industrial buildings in the Netherlands. Related to this statement, and I will explain later, preservation through development. And I'll try to conclude something in the end of the presentation upon the developments I have observed and the shifts that, in my opinion, took place in the Netherlands over the past decades that we all can learn from, not only here in Western Europe, but I think all over the world. So I will do a short introduction, talk a bit on modern heritage or industrial heritage in the Netherlands. We'll also explain something on preservation through development. I will show you some examples. A few are named here, and I added some more, some in a few slides, some with only one image. And as I mentioned, I will try to make some concluding remarks. Well, Ceila already kindly introduced me, but this is a bit of the visual introduction of myself. I look at myself as being born as a builder. My father was a carpenter, so you can imagine that building and derived from the building, architecture in general, but actually also the creation, restoration, renovation, adaptive reuse is in my veins, is in my DNA. And on top of that, I'd like to really to co-create, to talk to you guys, and be engaged at TU Delft as a loyal employee in organizing all different kinds of events. And as introduced also by Ceila, I'm active in Docomomo, so I'll try to be a bit activistic now and then. So now back to industrial heritage. Industrial heritage, adaptive reuse of industrial heritage. When I showed this image in the Netherlands, especially the left image, the warehouse Santos in Rotterdam, almost half of the room containing half of the room of architects start smiling, because this building, this warehouse was, let's say, from 1990 up to 2005, was one of the subjects for a design exercise for every student in architecture at TU Delft. So for this building, I don't know how many, but let's say 400 to 500 plans, designs were made every year. So times 15 years, I think over 5,000 designs were made for this building. It was empty for a long time, and now actually, finally, I would say, this warehouse, this piece of very nice industrial heritage, is under conversion, will be adaptively reused into a modern warehouse. We can discuss a lot about the architecture here and have an opinion on that, but that was not the idea of showing you this image. The idea is that I made a design for this building when I was a student, and a lot of my colleagues now teaching in university, but also walking around in the wild as an architect in the Netherlands, they made a design for this building. So adaptive reuse of industrial buildings is already a common practice in education, in architectural education, for the last at least 30 years. Also meant as an introduction, I really like this scheme. I was intrigued already by this scheme when I was still studying. It says the quality versus the time. And if we have a building or a building material, we all know that it degrades over time. And the principle of maintenance or renovation or any act in taking care of buildings, of materials, is that if it drops below a certain level of acceptability, we try to intervene to repaint, for example, the window frames, or to reglaze, or to do whatever, a bigger intervention, to bring it into the range of acceptable quality, with the aim, that's the aim of traditional renovation, to bring the quality every time a step upwards. Already during my studies, I was intrigued by this scheme, and I rediscovered it some years ago when I was working in heritage. And it's actually really interesting, because it's not about the scheme, but the scheme already says a lot about heritage. It questions the moment of intervention. Do we always have to wait until the quality drops below the level of acceptability? Or do we even wait longer until it's really not acceptable anymore, and then we do an upgrade? How far do we upgrade the quality? Is it only a minor quality upgrade or a huge quality upgrade? For how long do we intervene? Is it only for a short time, or do we expect to have a longer time span of 25, probably more years, to intervene again? What is the range of acceptability? Is it only that narrow, or is it even wider? Or should it be wider? What is the angle of acceptability? Do we always want the quality to increase? So when you look at this scheme with thinking about heritage, thinking about cultural heritage, thinking about built cultural heritage, values involved, then you can question yourself all these kind of things. And that's what we are working with within heritage and architecture, the group that works at TU Delft with heritage. It always works in the triangle, or tries to work in the triangle related to design, design for the future, interpreting the designs of the past, working with values, increasing values, recognizing values, intangible, tangible, and it works with technology, technology of the past, technology of the future, sustainability, etc. And of course, we play around in this field with a lot of colleagues. I always mention those books not to make it as a big advertisement, but our way of working is represented in those 5 books. To illustrate that we are still working in education with industrial heritage, this is a leaflet of a design studio we're starting in September, actually in 2 weeks. It's the so-called SSP Hall. It's in the east of the country of the Netherlands, where an industrial building within an industrial complex is empty and ready to be upgraded, to be transformed, I think in this case, to a hotel venue. And we're working on that with 30 to 40 students. Also by means of introducing, this is a value mapping basis we use for that. I will not come back to that, but just show you that in education we use this scheme to let students work on identifying values, not only, I have to say, in industrial heritage, but in a wider range of heritage. You invited me to give this lecture, and probably you have had a talk by Theodora before and on another occasion, or you met her in another Tiki occasion, but she was a PhD student with us in Heritage and Architecture at TU Delft, and her PhD, Control Shift on European Industrial Heritage, Reuse and Review. If you didn't do, I think it is a must read. I will share the DOI later. She did an inventory on the reuse of industrial heritage in several countries, the Netherlands, the UK, Spain, and Greece. And actually, she won a Europa Nostra award for her PhD thesis. So she is proud of that, but we as a teaching team are also proud about her work. So knowing more about industrial heritage in Europe, and especially the reuse of industrial heritage, this one is a must read. But now back to the Netherlands. I'm not here lecturing in architectural history, not lecturing on, gladly, not lecturing on the history of conservation in the Netherlands, but to understand, and I will come to that in a minute, the idea of preservation through development, which is, in my opinion, something typically Dutch. I have to explain you something about heritage care or organized heritage protection in the Netherlands. Already in the 1870s, so the late 19th century, the first attempts were made to institutionalize heritage protection in the Netherlands. Some very first initiatives by the government, which resulted in the beginning of the 20th century in a committee to make an inventory, to make inventories of possible monuments. So a large pile of books were written, all with mainly old building, medieval buildings, 16th, 17th, 18th century buildings, complete description on why they are valuable in order to be preserved. In 1916, the first conservation principles were written in the Netherlands, and the main line of those principles was in Dutch, behoud gaat voor vernieuwen. If I would translate that in English, it is preservation goes before renewal or before restoration. So preserving first and then thinking about replacement. As a result of all those activities, the first version of the Dutch Heritage Agency was established approximately 100 years ago, resulting in the first monuments law in 1961. In 1990, some institutional documents were still produced in the Netherlands by the Cultural Heritage Agency with a very large focus on reversibility in line with the Charter of Venice from 1964. And then in 1999, the Nota Belvedere, as it is called in the Netherlands, was written. I'll come back to it later, where this famous line, preservation through development, is mentioned. Of course, history didn't stop in 1999, but I brought you to this point, and I have a bit more on that. Another thing you should know is that in the Netherlands, buildings can only be listed if they are 50 years old, at least 50 years old. And those two developments in the 1980s. So in the 1980s, there was an assignment to do a technical research on younger buildings. Younger buildings meaning the buildings of the 20th century. That was done by Hubert Jan Henket and Wessel de Jonge, and that was actually the beginning of Docomomo, which was established in 1988. As a follow-up to this research, there was a nationwide inventory made of buildings with heritage value, so not specifically industrial buildings, but in general, an inventory made of buildings with potential heritage value from this period, 1850 to 1940. That was some kind of a catch-up way, because before only the so-called older buildings were described. 150,000 buildings were shortly described, and about 10% was listed. In the same period, as I mentioned, Docomomo was established, and also FIN was established, and FIN is the Dutch version of the Tiki. So it's the Federation on Industrial Heritage, already in 1984. And all in this context, there came this Nota Belvedere that was written. There was a governmental document where a lot of ministries came together and wrote a vision on how to further develop the Netherlands, and it was explicitly stated that cultural historical values should be embedded in the spatial development of the Netherlands. If I combine that statement with the inventory of recent or young buildings inventoried and listed, we come to this statement, preservation through development. So a lot of buildings with cultural historical value identified, listed or not, doesn't matter in this case, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the statement of the government to embed cultural historical values in the development, the spatial development of the Netherlands. Those two combined led to this statement, preservation through development. So a way of preserving those buildings, conserving those buildings through developing them. And developing in contrast to only preserving, conserving in the state they have now, or bringing them back to their previous state. So that is the birth of this preservation through development, which is in the title of my presentation. And as I'm Dutch, I will talk mainly about Dutch examples, because those Dutch examples, of course, took place in this under the umbrella of preservation through development. But you could also look at other countries or other projects with this glasses, because actually when I was looking up and looking forward for images for this presentation, the first one that came to my mind was this one. This one, and I don't know whether you recognize it or have seen it before. This is a adaptively reused, well, whether it's an industrial building, let's not discuss about that, but it's a building in the harbor of Antwerp, and the building on top or crossing it is a Zaha Hadid edition. I've seen this, and I took this image myself some months ago, and it was actually the first time that I saw this building. I saw the images before for years, and it was used by colleagues actually to criticize adaptive reuse of heritage buildings. And well, we can discuss on architecture, we can discuss on heritage and how those two met, but actually I agreed with him. I found the contrast between the historic building and the newly added building and how they literally meet or crash into each other based on the images I've seen. Well, let's say I was not a big fan, but when I was walking around in Antwerp early this year together with my oldest child, I also came to this position. And when you take a closer look, when you look very good to the middle of this photograph, there you see again this intervention by Zaha Hadid architects to this existing building. And now I started to understand what the architect wanted to do. They made this ship landing, crossing, crashing into the building, actually pointing at the harbor. So the ship is pointing towards the harbor where I am standing at this moment. Of course, it doesn't change the architecture. It doesn't change the way the new meets the old. But when I was here, I started to understand the architecture, and I started to see that it was probably more effective, better from a design perspective than I thought before. Well, this presentation is not about criticizing good architecture or bad architecture, or judging between good and wrong, but judging effectiveness or the result of adaptive reuse is always there when you select images, when you select stories for a presentation like this. Well, I'll come back to that in one of my last slides on effectiveness, but I hope you forgive me and by showing examples, and you might not agree with me whether it is a good example or a good approach. We can always discuss, and sometimes I might even try to exaggerate the statement on what has been done to initialize some discussion. Talking about industrial heritage, I don't think we can go around industrial heritage in the Netherlands. We cannot go around, I will not go around the vanilla factory, especially with my Docomomo International hat on. I will always refer to the vanilla factory in the Netherlands, which was adaptively reused. Actually, it states here 1999 to 2004, but actually the process already started approximately 10 years earlier. This is a real 1920s, 1930s modernist factory, an open factory, a daylight factory, which was adaptively reused by Wessel de Jonge architects and others. In the end, it won the Europa Nostra Award, and it was listed as UNESCO World Heritage in 2014. Whether you've seen those images or not, but you can imagine it was all like a machine. The building was only a shell around the actual process, the procedure that took place in the factory, tobacco, coffee, etc. But what is relevant here for the process and the procedures, there was the first time in the Netherlands that such a huge complex, I don't know the square meters by heart, was such a huge industrial heritage complex. Actually, it wasn't heritage when they started. It was only listed during the process. When they started to adaptively reuse or design for adaptive reuse of this building, there was no process, no procedure in the Netherlands legal to deal with that. The only thing that we had in the Netherlands were estates. So traditional country estates. That was a method and a methodology, because it also included buildings, land, different buildings, main buildings, side buildings, etc., etc. So when they started working on this industrial heritage site, they started actually with traditional estates, or the procedures from traditional estates, and afterwards that was transformed into a procedure that's used afterwards also for other industrial complexes. So it's a whole process, and it took like 10-15 years with all the stakeholders, investors, architects, heritage professionals, etc., to not only make the design for the adaptive reuse, but also reinvent the processes, the procedures to do so. And once again, it was not listed as a heritage building when they started. Only during the process, when they dived into the importance, into the values of the building, when they started redesigning, all people discovered that this was a very, very valuable building, and it was declared heritage during the process, and not the other way around, just to show you some more images. And that was, of course, the occasion to organize the 10th International Docomomo international conference there, which we named back then already the challenge of change. So change, in a way, should, in my opinion, be embraced. It is a challenge to deal with it. And of course, there is something, sometimes you should be hesitant towards change, but it's a challenge to deal with that. Also keep in mind this preservation through development ID. Some more images showing the richness of this building and the different occasions that it can be used for, which was shown by the Docomomo conference. Another aspect, another organization I cannot and will not go around is BUI. BUI, I actually don't know what is the exact abbreviation, but it's started as a foundation in the Netherlands to adaptively reuse buildings. So it was a private organization with private money who saw an opportunity. There was an empty industrial building, and it's actually the building on the image there. It was a brick producing plant. That was the first building. They bought it with very little money and transformed it into, I think in this case, it's housing. And when they did this trick, so to say, they said, "Hey, we can do that more often." They formed an organization, got money from the public and private money, and started to do more investments, buying industrial, but also industrial heritage, but also churches and other types of heritage. And one by one, they converted them into a new function. If you go to the website, and it's mentioned on the sheet, you cannot read it, but I selected industrial, the industrial typology, and it says in the category of industrial buildings, BUI has already dealt with 47 buildings in the Netherlands over the past 25 years. All over the Netherlands, small buildings, large buildings, huge complexes, etc. Their way of working, and this is one of the latest and biggest projects they are working on, it's the Central Market Hall in the Netherlands, the so-called, in Amsterdam, the so-called food center. Very, very large building on the periphery of Amsterdam. Most often they start with very little money, try to gain the money from private and public investors, combine one and one together, make a nice website on this, and focus on the importance of a building like this in the community. And I enlarged the header of the website, and then most of their website, every project they start, more or less has a website like this. It's always about the past, which is nothing new, and it's about the future, which is also nothing new. But they also always, especially with the larger projects, have a very large chunk of present in it. Of course, they want to rent it out or sell it again, so there is an offer on it. And it's also a button on those websites. And of course, it's not about the button, but it's what is behind. It's about the stories. And I think BUI really needs to be credited for it, that they focused from the beginning on the immaterial values, the immaterial, mainly the stories. So they tried to find people that worked there before, recorded on video their stories, did nice interviews, put it online, made books, made leaflets to get this building alive again, because it is most often empty, it's deserted, it's not in use anymore. We can talk a lot about the past, but we are living in the present. And what BUI really nicely does, they try to directly do some activities in the buildings based on the old stories, based on the people that work there, do some temporary work in those buildings, which gives a bit relaxation also financially to design for the future. Start with the external shell, make it watertight, and then go into the internal of the building. Of course, you would say, yeah, if it doesn't work in Amsterdam, it doesn't work anywhere. Amsterdam, a big city, rich city, high pressure on the housing market. So it's rather easy to do a project like this in Amsterdam. I tend to agree with you, but Boei also worked, for example, on the Enka factory. The Enka factory in Ede. I don't know how well your topography of the Netherlands is developed, but Ede is not, let's say, not the center of the world. It's a city more or less in the east of the country, and there this big factory where they wove nylon cords was established in the early 20th century, growing, etc., until this product was not made anymore, and like everywhere in the world, this building became empty. Boei bought it, and it was their worst nightmare. It was not only the building you see here, there was a fire, well, you could think of everything, it all happened there. It took for years to develop this building, to redevelop this building. Over, I think 15 years later, they found a new client for this building. It's a very nice, you can't get it more Dutch than it is, but it's called, I think, the Biking Center. That's a biking experience center of a bike producer. You can try out every bike in that they sell in that building. But now again, I talk about the building, but it's not about the building, it's about this site. And that is what is so nice here in Ede. It's a huge site, a factory terrain next to the railway to the east of the country. And this building, or the leftovers of this building, is only a part of it. And the fact that this industrial remains are all over this site was the selling point of this area. You see a chimney, you see a building, a part of a building, a wall, and they were all integrated in the design. They were integrated not at moment zero, designed all over. No, there was some kind of a master plan, refined, etc., etc. It took 15 to 20 years to develop this whole terrain, all with the idea to keep the industrial spirit, to focus on the industrial elements, and create mainly housing over there. So adaptively reuse the different industrial remainings. And of course, if you make housing, new housing, you also need a school. At least that's what happens in most countries. Schools are made, and in the former restaurant of the factory, a new school was created. I will not go into detail in the interventions in this school, but you can imagine that to make classrooms, you have to make larger rooms, larger spaces that were not there. So a lot of structural interventions were necessary here to make this very nicely designed modern building, a cafeteria, restaurant, into a school building. It was done by Wessel de Jonge architects. Another project I'd like to show to you is in Leeuwarden. Leeuwarden is also not the center of the world, but it's a very nice historic center, as you see already on the images and on the the structure of the city. Has some canals around the center. You see on the image upper right. Rather close to the city center, there was a prison. That was established in the early or the second half of the 19th century, when it was the edge of the city. Well, you can imagine the city has grown around it. The prison stayed on its same spot, of course, and became actually part of the city center, where in the beginning, when it was built, it was almost a rural site. Prison did not comply with the current regulations or the late legislation, So it was sold by the government, and a new function was sought after. And the whole complex was adaptively reused into the main function, or the biggest function here in the floor plan, the upper left, the greenish, a public library, and some other functions in it. I will go back and forth in those two images, because this is also an interesting fact for this complex. It's a huge complex you see here, so it's a lot of cells, 1, 2, 3 different parts built in different time frames you can imagine, and they took the decision, the local government took the decision to relocate their public library in a part of the building. So it was some kind of a placemaking activity to put the library in there. Well, not many people know the inside of a prison, luckily, but this was the opportunity of a lot of people to come into the prison, to start getting to know the building as part of the urban fabric of the city center of Leeuwarden. And by doing so, there was a placemaking activity, and now there is also a very nice hostel in this building. So if you ever want to stay a few days in a prison, you don't have to commit a crime. You just can book a room in this very nice hostel in the city of Leeuwarden, where you can stay in a cell. And here you see how the left, the image, how the 19th century prison was converted into a 20th century and actually 21st century prison. A lot of redesigns took place to comply with the latest regulation. And on the image right, the complete reconstruction, repainting of the original prison. Some offices in it, mixed with the hostel, entrepreneurs, etc. And the image right, I took in the beginning of the year, and probably not so good to see on this image, but this is not the standard that we would go for in conservation of the facades. And it's a part that still needs to be done. So if I go back to those, they do it in parts. So they start somewhere, they have a bigger plan, how to comply with the whole complex, but it's not done at once. They do it phase by phase. And I think that is one of the big and good points of preservation through development. If you want to develop something, that takes time, that takes money, that takes investments, and that also means that it's very difficult and probably also unlikely to plan it all at once in the beginning. I'll go back to Amsterdam, and I see I'm already speaking for 40 minutes, so I have to speed up a little. Oostenburg, one of the former islands in the eastern part of Amsterdam, the former Werkspoor and Stork terrain. We did study this terrain at Heritage and Architecture. We did some student work on it. But if I show you this image, this was the situation, I think, in the 1950s, early 1950s. So a huge industrial sites, building on building, next to building, etc., etc. And this is what's currently left over of it. So it's about winning and losing. A lot of developments are taking place. There are solitary buildings, and that is actually the most interesting one. It's very difficult now to point at that. I point at it with my finger, but I show it in the next slide. One of those industrial buildings, and you see it here on the upper left, is integrated in a row of houses. So it's actually made like industrial sites are constructed, just one next to each other, very pragmatic. If we need another building, just demolish one and build a new one. That's the way, and actually the latest development that took place there. The development, the mirroring image to the right was a development project of 10 years ago. All the industrial buildings were demolished and a new construction was built. So talking about development here, you really see a development in only 10 years from total destruction and building new into a full integration on the top left of an industrial building. I don't know the exact function, but we will know in due time. Up lower right, another complex, the so-called Van Genthallen. I remember that with students, I think already 15 years ago, we studied this building and made redesigns. Nothing really happened, only temporary use happened until last year. So it was always in process. They were always trying to get money, trying to find people interested in investing in it. So you might think in the Netherlands, everything is possible, but those procedures really take long. And I can really recommend this website. Again, of course, it's all in Dutch, but I think you can see and learn a lot from it, how they do it, how they did it. The investor, the owner, and the architects are movies, are interviews with them on this website, how they see the process, how they want to invest, what they want to invest, how they see the return on investment, and how they deal with the heritage values of this building complex. Very interesting project, which is difficult now to show you, but take a look at vangenthallen.com and check out the interviews with the stakeholders. I cannot go around the Lokhal in Tilburg. It's a rather recent transformation of an abandoned train maintenance building next to the railroad in Tilburg. It was listed as a local monument, and it was next, as I said, next to the railway station of Tilburg, but on the wrong side. So actually on the outside, not on the city side, but on the back side. So it was very difficult area for adaptive reuse. But the local government took up the challenge and invited an interesting team of architects to redevelop this 11,000 square meter. It was opened already 3.5 or 4 years ago, and I think it won more or less every worldwide award on architecture that is available over there. Large halls, a lot of train maintenance, all there. Here next to the railroad, the large complex. As I told you, it won, well, virtually every prize you could win. And why was that? That was because it really added something. It added something to the city. It gave the city something back. It gave the city an area back that it had lost years before. Yeah, unluckily, I had a very rainy day when I visited the building, so my pictures are rather rainy. But on the one image, the view from the station, and the other, the view to the station. With the redesign, in this case, a public library and office spaces, they managed to really use and reuse the big spaces that the building gave actually to the designers. And you may argue that it is rather easy to redesign such a big space, but here one image on the right, they actually did it to the details. So on the glass, on the copper, new elements visiting old elements, etc. So very nicely done. And the building also features a very specific glass hall in it. So the log hall on the left, you see, well, you barely see it, but it's the glass hall on the left. And there was a glass hall that was formerly constructed in the Beurs van Berlage in Amsterdam. So the famous Beurs van Berlage, where this glass concert hall was built in, did not comply with the demands there. It was demounted and put back again into practice in this log hall. Just a little sidestep. I'll show you something on schokbeton, and you might recognize schokbeton as a topic I presented before during the Lele 90 event in Brazil. But it's interesting that talking about industrial heritage, in this case, we talk about industrial buildings. But what if industrial buildings or former industrial buildings also contain interesting historical, from a historical point of view, cultural historical point of view, interesting industrial elements. So there in the industry and industry comes together? Well, I just leave it here as a question, but that is an interesting fact. Just an interesting question that came to me at the university a few weeks ago, and it's about maritime industrial heritage. You may recognize here the Netherlands, in the circle, the part of South Holland around Rotterdam. Rotterdam, the big harbor. Everybody knows Rotterdam, at least a lot of people know Rotterdam, but it's actually Rotterdam up to the North Sea, where all the famous harbor activities are. But we are asked to look at the area behind Rotterdam, where the different rivers are actually streaming towards the sea through Rotterdam. And that's a very interesting area with around the city of Dordrecht, but a lot of other different cities. It's about 65 kilometers of waterways, and 65 kilometers of waterways also means that you have twice that many shores. A lot of water-related activities, a lot of industries related to water, boat yards, shipyards, other industries, a lot of buildings inside, and 9 municipalities involved. And we were asked, and are asked, and we are now in the middle of making a plan, how to study this area, this 65 kilometers of waterway, and how to inventory, and I just took a random aerial view of that, how to inventory those shores to identify potential heritage values within the industrial heritage, within the old structures. Well, I don't know yet how we are going to deal with it, but it's indeed a challenging exercise, because this was just one of the views, but I can assure you it's approximately 65 kilometers of developments like this. So when I need help, I know where to find you. I have a few minutes to round up with my last slides, and I wanted to show you this Eiffel building, the Sphinx factory, which is a ceramics factory, an old ceramics factory, former ceramics factory in Maastricht. Maastricht is in the south of the country, and this building was completely refurbished, adaptively reused into a student hotel a few years back. I show you these two images, and if you don't know, you actually can't see which is before and which is the after. The lower one is the after one, I can assure you. In the Netherlands, the climate of the Netherlands, we're always discussing about keeping the cold outside. So what is the regular procedure from a building physical point of view is to wrap a building on the outside, make the insulation on the outside, put a new cladding on it, and go on with the building, make a new infill, that's it. But when talking about industrial heritage buildings, then this is not the first thing to do. On the left image, you see the old surface of the outside, the steel window frames, the brickwork there. And there was a huge debate going on whether to insulate this building on the outside or on the inside. Normally, with industrial buildings, we would choose to insulate on the inside to keep the image more or less the same as before. But here it was chosen to specifically insulate on the outside because the envelope has an inside too. And it was chosen to have the old industrial look, the industrial atmosphere in the inside, where it could be more valuable to the inhabitants of those apartments than on the outside. Because the outside, it's mainly about this bigger view, was argued, and that did not really change, of course, in terms of authenticity and what is real and what is fake. You can have the debate, but that was the debate that took place. And here I show you the result of that debate. I will skip this one, the Ploeg in Bergijk. Is it always perfect in the Netherlands? No, of course not. Many industrial sites have been demolished or will still be demolished over time. On the left, two images of a schokbeton factory in Kampen there is nothing to be found back, as you can see on the right image of that original factory. Industrial, might have been industrial heritage, but it never got the chance to become heritage because it was already demolished. Here, one of the other modernist industrial buildings. We have a lot of them, specifically in the city of Eindhoven, former Philips factory, you know, the Philips from the light bulbs, exposed concrete walls with steel window frames, very functionalist and rational organized building. And a lot of those buildings have been converted. And when you compare the conversions of two of the buildings, I will do on the next slide, you see that there is a very big difference between and you can already imagine a conversion to a public program or to a more closed program of offices and or homes, dwellings. So on the upper one, there was one of the buildings was converted into a public program, in this case a library and offices, where they created open spaces matching completely with the structure of the beam and columns and floor system, leaving openness all over. And the other one where they made little homes in it, and I got this from a real estate agent, this image. It was just all height and floor, and inside you will barely recognize the spaciousness of this building. The discussion on whether the one is more effective and better than the other is a very difficult one, and I'm not going to solve that here. I'm not going to give the definitive answer, but a PhD student of mine wrote a very nice paper on that one. She inventoried from jury reports on architectural prizes the terms, the criteria that were used to nominate a project as being effective in nice. So it's very nice paper where you see a lot of input on the criteria for effectiveness. I'm sorry to go back to Belgium once more. This is something that I won't say I hate it, but this is, I think, one of the worst ways to deal with industrial heritage, industrial sites, and in a way heritage buildings in general. It says in Dutch, old soul, new infill. So what they do here, what they did, and actually this is the image they advertise this project with. It's completely new, but they count on the historic soul that should be in the building, the touch and feel of the historic material, because this one is right back to it. So they only keep the envelope. The rest is torn down with a focus on this harbor intervention. I really do not like the way they use, or actually, in my opinion, misuse industrial heritage or the image of industrial heritage for this project. A few slides on success factors. I think temporary use has a very high success factor to initiate change. Did not mention it today, but when I look over the past 20 years, I think quality control in terms of architects, people involved in heritage care, and there's a very nice foundation in the Netherlands on quality control that was also established 20-25 years ago, continue with this preservation through development. That is necessary. You have to count on quality. Also established 20 years ago was the National Renovation Platform, NRP. I think that is really instrumental, that there is this platform, not an academic platform, but a platform from investors, through investors, contractors that bring knowledge together, share their ideas, and share their thoughts, share their projects openly. And I think that was instrumental in creating the success of adaptive reuse of industrial buildings in the Netherlands. And also this one, the national prize. That would probably in Brazil more be a regional prize. Doesn't matter, but I think if there is a prize, in this case it's on renovation phoenix, the rising phoenix. A lot of industrial heritage has been redeveloped. It's documented through this website, and by every year having this prize announced to a specific building, I think that keeps it on the agenda, and that's what I concluded here. I think development is able to preserve a lot of heritage, but it's not able to preserve all heritage aspects. Preservation is always a joint effort. It's not only an effort of an owner, of a single architect, of a single heritage officer. It is a joint effort of owners, investors, heritage officers, architects, contractors, and the general public. And I think we have to accept, we as academics or we as heritage fighters, we have sometimes to accept that we lose some. You win some, but you also lose some. Pragmatism, especially with industrial heritage, I think pragmatism is needed, often, not always, above dogmatism. I think I showed it, and then if you look to the websites I mentioned, I think the intangible aspects are very important with industrial heritage. The intangible aspects you can build upon. It doesn't give you an answer how to convert a building, what function to bring in, but it gives the stories, it gives the continuity from past to present to future. And this, of course, perfectly aligns with communication. Communication through new media, it is important. Temporary use, I pointed at it once or twice, is an instrument that is used a lot, that goes often right, of course goes wrong now and then. I pointed already on the non-academic knowledge network, and as I told before, preservation in the end comes down to craftsmen who execute the work. If there is no craftsman, or if there is no group of craftsmen willing to take up the challenge, then you are nowhere. And as I mentioned, the annual prize really, really helps. I spent an hour, I'm sorry for that, but I have some final warnings that I will round up on, that I did not point at it during this presentation, and of course you all know them. Gentrification is something to really look at, because it's very easy to push people away which are underprivileged by converting, adaptively reusing industrial buildings, industrial sites. I think we may conclude in the Netherlands that in the past we might have been paying too much attention to buildings, to separate buildings, and too little to the urban tissue. I think we are now changing that and to integrate the development of the urban tissue into the redevelopment of the building. And cleaning up industrial sites is on the one hand a good thing, but it sometimes is also overdone. And once you cleaned up, you will never get back what you cleaned up. Thank you. This is the final slide. Thank you for your attention. And well, if there is time for questions, I'm happy to answer, but if not, we'll do that another time. Thank you once more.
Thank you once again, Wido. You made a very nice presentation, very interesting examples, some of them new, some others I would like to. I think more people here is very interested in what you said, and thank you very much. Eu pergunto a vocês se tem tempo ainda para alguma pergunta, a organização pode ajudar com isso? A participar.
Tem sim, Ceila, tem 15 minutos, 14 minutos.
Sim, então eu abro para as participações. Alguém que esteja presente gostaria de fazer alguma pergunta? Bem, tem uma sim?
Eu escrevi alguma coisa, não sei se você entendeu a minha pergunta.
Isso eu já ia ler aqui, Tatiana. A sua eu vi que está aqui. Então, você quer saber mais sobre o que ele apresentou? Dos valores. Você fala do gráfico tempo-qualidade?
Ele apresentou um que tem até o spirit value. Eu queria saber se tem a ver com os valores afetivos que a gente determina aqui, que é a população local, geralmente, né, em inventário participativo, se existe isso, se esses atores estão incluídos, as pessoas, nesse processo.
Well, Wido, there's a question for you. Are you there? Can't see you.
I'm here.
Oh, good. Well, there's someone here asking, is Tatiana Carleto. She has a question for you. She would like to understand a bit more about that framework, about quality time, and also how you built there, how the people were involved in building that kind of values, and if you used to hear people when you are building the values, the listed values for preserving an industrial building or heritage in general.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether I understand the question correctly, but talking about involving people, involving general public, and I think specifically with industrial heritage, and I mentioned that before, a lot of industrial heritage in the Netherlands is not officially listed. So it is not listed as a monument, most of it at least not listed as a national monument, some as a local monument or important building. But the ideas of adaptively reusing it most often come from the general public, because those sites are on the edges of the city. The cities are growing, so these industrial sites are incorporated actually within the new city boundaries. The people living around are interested in those locations, trying to be involved and try to start up redevelopment, sometimes starting it informally and then over time continuing that into a formal approach. So that's the one side. So a lot of initiatives come from the general public, and the other one is, and that's what I see in all those websites and in the approach of Bui I mentioned, but also some of the architects, they really but they try to engage as much as possible those old men and women who tend to work in those sites and record their oral histories of this site. And it's always very difficult to make this intangible oral history, to make it tangible. But the fact that it is recorded, that the architect or the heritage officer or the investor start talking to those people and trying to get to know them, I'm convinced that without one-to-one being able to redirect one decision to something that one of these former workers states, it influences the development. And I think that is the value of it. And of course, if those stories get recorded by rather easy, but just by iPhone, recorded and spread through a website or YouTube or whatever kind of platform, I think that really helps to get other people involved, other former workers coming forward and being involved in this conversion. They will, in the beginning, always be against every change. But when you involve, when you start to talk to them, they recognize the fact that it is important to develop it. It cannot stay the same as before, because then it will rot away. I think we see more and more positive examples of that. But it's always a low-profile initiative. There's no heritage officers saying, okay, you have to interview 10 people, 10 former workers, otherwise you will not get a permit. No, it's rather informal one-to-one contacts. Does that more or less answer the question?
I think so. Você entendeu, Tatiana? A pergunta está respondida? Yes, she understood well. So it's good. I have another question, but maybe it's kind of similar to this one, because, well, I would like to hear more from you about the process of defining the new functions, how it happens, how it used to happen.
I mean, when I overlooked my presentation, I saw that there were 3 libraries in it. That was not on purpose. And I think a library or a function like that is, from the Dutch perspective, is a rather easy function, because it is openness. At least the Dutch libraries are in the middle of the community. A lot of public interest. That they are not like there's one old lady sitting behind the desk and lending out one book after the other. It's an open community, so it really fits. The function of a library fits with those larger industrial buildings. But on the other hand, it also does not require a lot of interventions on those buildings. So that is a difficulty, and the good thing about them, when you scroll through the examples of the BUI project, it shows 47 different project. I think they also managed to convert a lot of industrial buildings into dwellings, into housing, and into offices, or a combination of that. But the choice of the function, the definition of the function, is a joint effort, and of course we can do a lot of, and some of you are teaching. So if you are teaching, you ask a student to design this function in that building. At least that's sometimes what I'm used to, and then you see what comes out. But that is not an actual exercise. What I see in the Netherlands is that there is a change going on from building new to converting the old. So actually, for every new function, everything that is needed in the eyes of an investor or the eyes of an owner, it's the other way around. So it's not the building that's there and you need the function for that. It's actually the other way around. We need offices for 10,000 square meters. Which building is available? We have to build a school. Is there an existing building where we can make an adaptive reuse plan? Of course, we need to add a piece, etc., etc. So I think more and more, it's not building seeks function, but function seeks building, and I think that's a good thing, because then the match can be more easily found. That
Well, very well. Function 6 buildings. Yes, it's perfectly understood.
Yeah, and that is a bit, and we are advocating, or trying to advocate, this statement of 100% heritage, right? In the Netherlands, it is like, so you need a permit to build. Or no. A building is only protected, or you cannot demolish a building when it is a monument. If we turn it around, you cannot demolish a building, then we need to start thinking about the reasons why to demolish. So it's not the other way around. If you start from the, and of course it's not always there like that, but I think more and more this idea of 100% heritage, and then I do not mean legally protected, but the idea of what's there is there, and let's try to use it from a sustainability point of view, from a circularity point of view. I think that is good, and we are of course still not there, because a lot of pollution, a lot of building materials is turned into waste, but the start of the movement is there.
Very nice. I just would like to emphasize preservation before renewal, and pragmatism before dogmatism, right?
Yeah, the pragmatism before dogmatism is are my words, so don't blame anyone else on that. But I think heritage protection has been ruled for 100 years, at least in Western Europe, by dogmatism. It is because it is, and it cannot be done because it cannot be done. And I think pragmatism, to put against, that's also not 100% correct, but at least it gives a lot of discussion, and I think it brings us a step further. So if you have some pragmatism involved with scholars, with contractors or architects, I think that is needed everywhere.
Yes, agreed. Is there any more question I will ask? Alguma pergunta mais, Rudy?
Ceila.
Oi.
Hello, Wido. How are you?
Hello.
I'd like to make a question for Wido. I'm Rudy from the Docomomo Brasil treasurer. I don't know if you remember me.
Of course, Rudy. Come again.
Okay. Wido, I don't know. I'm not in it's not my field. The theories about preservationism and heritage, but I'd like to know, for example, if you can make a quick parallel between the theories or texts or a lot of books that were written about heritage and in preservationism, a parallel between the day by day of making decisions of the reuse of those buildings that you mentioned. You know, if you can tell me, because nowadays, I mean, I'm in a situation because I have a studio. I'm not in the academy in these days, but I have a studio and I'm working with a reusing of a building, a modern building here in South Brazil. So I have this question because sometimes I feel like a bit lost if I'm doing the correct decision, you know, based on some texts that I read in well, everywhere.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question, but a difficult question, and I think in heritage, I think we tend to refer to the Charter of Venice and the at least in Western Europe, and the NARA document on authenticity, and probably the World Heritage Convention. I think those are the three most referred to documents, but in a way, how they are written, they are rather dogmatic. For example, the Charter of Venice really speaks about reversibility. So everything you do on a historic heritage building need to be able to be undone. Well, if that is always the starting point in adaptive reuse, you will never make it, because you have to make too many interventions that will never be able to be undone. And that's why, and that's something you could search on. I think the discussion on compatibility, retreatability, and durability, I think those three terms at least help us with students to debate more and to get away from this dogma. If you do something, you need to design it in such a way that you can always reverse the situation. If you talk about compatibility, that's more some kind of a suitability. So does it match? Does it harm? If it harms, you should choose something else. And harming, you can also talk in terms of architecture or in shapes. Of course, it's difficult, but then you get in a discussion: does it fit? Doesn't it fit? How does it fit? How does it intervene? And how is the relation between the old and the new? And then, of course, one can disagree with the other, but at least you get clear where on what you disagree and which aspect it doesn't fit. Also, durability, something should be, be able to stay as long as possible, is an interesting one. And retreatability, if I do an intervention here, can I redo that again or something similar in due time when necessary?
Okay.
Those are the terms, at least I use in education with students. Of course, there are more, but that will take another day to discuss, Rudy.
No, thank you very much. It was very helpful. Thank you, Ceila.
Well, welcome, Rudy. Well, que mais? Oh, tem uma pergunta mais aqui, a gente ainda teria tempo? A pessoal da organização pode ajudar aqui?
Ceila, pode ver mais uma perguntinha e a gente entra, que o pessoal da segunda mesa já está esperando.
Tá bem. Just one more short question, Wido. There's someone asking about social housing in these projects of adaptive reuse of industrial building. Do you have any example of social housing in adaptive reuse industrial buildings?
Good question. It takes long to find the answer, and I don't know whether you know the Dutch situation in building housing at the moment, but there is really a problem in building housing in general. So I don't have the example ready, but what I, for example, the example I showed in Amsterdam, where this hall was really integrated in housing. There is also, because in the Netherlands, every building project needs to have a part social housing. It is part of it, but it's not directly connected to these industrial heritage buildings. I really would have to think about it, but good question, but I'm sorry I don't have the answer at this particular moment. You challenge me, so I will see.
Thank you very much, Wido. Also nice to hear from you.
You're welcome.
So we are finished. Thank you very much. And obrigada a todos pela participação. Acho que terminamos aqui a nossa conversa. O mais assunto fica para adiante, né? Sempre temos muito o que falar. Agradeço muito o convite por estar aqui, recebendo meu colega, professor Wido. Obrigada, Kaki. Então, seguimos. Bye, bye, Wido. Thank you.